A dance of death in the Spanish village of Verges. It has taken place in the early hours of Good Friday for 600 years. And today the local people still reenact the dark obsessions of the Middle Ages. Superstition, fear of death, guilt, the need to suffer as Jesus suffered. But there was another side to the medieval world, the landscape dominated by those astonishing buildings, the great cathedrals. For the age of superstition and fear was also the age of faith. Chartres, near Paris, seems the very symbol of that age. Its cathedral is one of the finest of nearly 200, built in the new Gothic style in the 13th and 14th centuries. They were the pride of the European cities. Siena, in central Italy, another reflection of a proud faith. The cathedral broods over its flock of small houses, but among those houses, in the narrow lanes of Siena, a darker world. Most of those born here in the Middle Ages died as children, and the average length of a human life was 30 years. No wonder the fear of death and unknown horrors beyond the grave became an obsession. For the people who lived in these cities, the building of a cathedral was more than a matter of pride, or even faith. It was an attempt to satisfy God. This is Bourges, south of Paris. Again, the church triumphant, dominant above the houses below. It's easy and conventional to see this as a soaring image of faith. But the church was also an astonishingly rich institution, diverting the pennies of the poor to the greater glory of God. Those who lived in grand houses near the cathedral were rich enough, but most people had very few pennies. In the fields below the cathedral, medieval peasants once worked. They had few chances in this world, but the church offered them consolation in the next. Theirs would be the kingdom of heaven, a guarantee denied to the rich who could enjoy themselves so well on earth. The rich man of Bourges was the Duke of Berry. This picture of him dining with his courtiers was painted for an unlikely purpose. It illustrates his prayer book. It is only one of many paintings which enliven the holy text. Some of them were clearly an aid to devotion. Others, showing scenes around the Duke's castles, seem more like light relief from the demands of worship. When it came to the peasants, the Duke's artist had the tact to show them remarkably well dressed. But in the month of December, even the Duke could appreciate that their life was not quite like his own. And it was not only the weather that was harsh. When a peasant died, the landlord took his best beast and the local priest his second best, even if he had only two. Many priests despised the peasants who turned the land into wealth.
Peasants are coarse, blubbery, gluttonous, rough-skinned, dirty. Their crooked manners are a consequence of their crooked bodies.
It was an attitude reflected in the English language. A churl was a poor freeman, and a villain was just a serf. But churlish and villainous, the words still speak for themselves. There was the odd voice of protest.
Innocent people die of hunger, while the great wolves fill their bellies. the grain, the corn. These are the blood and the bones of the poor which have gone into the land, for which their souls cry to God, vengeance.
For most people, it would have to be God's vengeance, not in this world, but in the next. The most detailed architectural drawing in the Duke of Berry's prayer book is the west front of his local cathedral at Bourges. Every time that he, or anyone else in Bourges, entered this cathedral, they were reminded of a vengeance that threatened them when they were dead. Above the main entrance is a sculpture which makes God's judgment all too plain. When the trumpet sounds on that last judgment day, the graves open and naked men and women clamber out to hear their fate. They are weighed in the balance, and those found wanting are led off by devils to the burning cauldrons. The spikes and prods and bites of those devils, the searing marks of pain on naked flesh, this was the scene, more than any other, that gripped the medieval mind. Both writers and painters were obsessed with the details of hell.
There is in the middle of the earth a place which is called hell. Thus much say I to you of this place, that it is full of fire and of burning sulfur. It is hideous, stinking, full of ordure, hot and anguishous.
But Jesus was judge as well as savior. It's hardly surprising with this ordeal ahead that the thought of death became even more obsessive than usual.
Behold, a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him.
Obsession with death increased as the centuries passed. And here at the Capuchin Cemetery in Rome, every scrap of decoration is a friar's bone. Memento mori. Remember, thou shalt die. Little chance of forgetting it here. The menacing skeleton with his scythe haunted the later Middle Ages. Today, the skeletons, still carrying their scythes, parade every Easter in the Spanish village of Verges. The passion play which the villagers perform is like a window on the Middle Ages, with its sense of impending doom. In the center of it all, Jesus suffers. To the villagers of Verges, it must seem that suffering is the central theme of the story of Christ, as if the pain were the point of it. The physical suffering of Christ was seized on by painters. as in this crucifixion by the German artist Grunewald. Here the flesh seems almost rotting, as if those dark medieval obsessions could putrefy even Jesus himself, corrupting the incorruptible. Yet in this moment of horror lay the one and only hope. For Christ, so everyone believed, had risen again even from this. He had conquered death. It feels good to be in the countryside again after all that death and damnation. The only way of avoiding the devil and his cauldron was to do penance for your sins while still on earth. But there were more pleasant ways of doing penance than wearing a hair shirt or saying 1,000 Hail Marys. And the most pleasant of all was to set out on pilgrimage. It was a serious business, moving from shrine to shrine, but it was also a very good outing. Pilgrimage was the tourism of the Middle Ages, and a party of pilgrims set out with just as much enthusiasm as any package tour today. And they'd be just as varied a group of people. Take Chaucer's wife of Bath, for example. She'd be good value on any tour. She knew almost as much about pilgrimage as about love. 3 times to Jerusalem, 5 times married. Well, that's a fair balance. And she'd been on all the obvious shorter trips. She'd been to Rome. She'd been to Santiago in Spain. She'd been to Cologne to inspect the relics of the 3 wise men. And if Chaucer had been writing 100 years earlier, he might well have sent her to this place, Vézelay, a small town in the center of France, which is still dominated today by its abbey church, and which in the 12th and 13th centuries was one of the most popular of all places of pilgrimage in Europe. A place becomes a tourist resort today if it has a good beach or famous buildings and works of art. But what mattered in the Middle Ages was relics, fragments of saints. And what brought the pilgrims here to Vézelay was Mary Magdalene, because the monks said they had her entire skeleton, give or take the odd bone. And that was a powerful attraction, because a pilgrim praying to a saint hoped that the saint up in heaven would put in a good word for him. And who better to do so than Mary Magdalene? She had been herself a sinner. It was believed even a prostitute, and yet she'd been a special friend of Jesus. So she, above all people, would surely understand. But there was also a commercial value to relics, and the monks and the priests were quite unscrupulous in how they came by these precious commodities. Saints were sold, they were cut up, sometimes they were even stolen. And a certain Bishop of Lincoln became extremely popular, at any rate in Lincoln, by the way he managed to bring back a relic to his cathedral. He'd been abroad on pilgrimage, and he knelt down to kiss what was said to be another bone of Mary Magdalene, not here in Vézelay, somewhere else. And when no one was looking, the good bishop managed to bite off the end of the bone. And to the eternal gratitude of Lincoln, he brought it safely home. The Abbey Church here in Vézelay is an indication of the material power of relics. The skeleton of Mary Magdalene brought so many pilgrims here in the 12th century that the monks were able to build what is now one of the great treasures of Romanesque architecture. Many of the great medieval shrines still have their pilgrims and their relics. But at Vézelay, local Protestants long ago burnt the remains of Mary Magdalene. And pilgrims here are little more than a memory. Every spring, students from Paris come to Chartres on pilgrimage. And as in the past, at the end of the journey, a solemn moment of wonder. To a modern pilgrim, the stained glass of Chartres comes as a revelation. In the 13th century, when the cathedral was built, it must have seemed even more amazing, for such a vast expanse of color was something entirely new. But it was the Virgin Mary who brought the medieval pilgrims to Chartres. She had become at that time the best loved figure in the entire Christian hierarchy. She was the most approachable member of the Holy Family, and she had influence where it counted most. St. Bernard explained how.
If you fear the Father, there is Christ the mediator. If you fear him, there is his mother. She will listen to thee. Then the Son will listen to her, and the Father to him.
The crypt at Chartres is blackened by the candles of centuries of pilgrims. And on the altar is the relic which more than anything else has brought them here, La Sainte Chemise, the holy tunic. It was believed in the Middle Ages to have been the Virgin's undergarment when she was giving birth to Jesus. A most intimate relic, you might think, but not by the standards of the Middle Ages. Every great church had by now a vast number of relics. You could hardly go any earlier than at Canterbury, where they showed the pilgrims some of the clay which they said had been left over after God had fashioned Adam. But this little reliquary here at Chartres does suggest very well how naive or how literal this whole business of relics had now become. It was designed to hold a relic of Jesus himself, and the trouble here was that he had ascended into heaven, so you couldn't have his skull or his bones, as with an ordinary saint. You had to make do with parts of his body which he had shed before his death. And this meant his milk teeth, various tears that he had wept, drops of blood. Most awe-inspiring of all, though, it meant the relic of the circumcision. And that was what this was designed to hold, what the French call le saint prépuce, which in English would be the holy foreskin. And at the height of the Middle Ages, there were no less than 15 such holy foreskins of Jesus being worshipped in various churches around Europe. They said that this one here was one of the best authenticated of them all. I'm sorry to say it has long since vanished, leaving us only with its precious casket. Reliquaries were the treasures of the church, often so ornate that the precious fragments of bone or wood within were hidden from view. So the shape outside would sometimes reflect the treasures inside, such as a piece of the true cross displayed in a cross. This lavish casket was made for the rich man of Bourges, the Duke of Berry, and was designed to hold just one thorn of the crown of thorns. But the entire crown of thorns, less one, the Duke of Berry would insist, was housed in even greater splendor. A full-scale church was created to contain it, La Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. It was built in the 13th century by a king of France who had bought the crown of thorns in Constantinople. He provided it with the most spectacular casket in the world. The Italian town of Assisi was the home of one man who rejected the wealth of the church. The son of a rich merchant, he refused to accept from his father money or even clothes. He was St. Francis. And the example he gave of simplicity and poverty persuaded many to join his new order of friars, the Franciscans. His friend St. Clare founded a similar order for women. But the poverty of St. Clare and St. Francis was not the dark poverty of the cities. It was the simplicity of the open air. And it is heard in the famous Canticle of the Sun, which Francis wrote when lying ill here in the garden of a convent which he had given to St. Clare.
Praise to thee, my Lord, for all thy creatures, above all brother sun, who brings us the day and lends us his light. Lovely is he, radiant with great splendor, and speaks to us of thee, O Most High. Praise to thee, my Lord, for sister moon and the stars, which thou hast set in the heavens, clear, precious, and fair. Praise to thee, my Lord, for brother wind, for air and cloud, for calm, and all weather by which thou supportest life in all thy creatures. Praise to thee, my Lord, for sister water, who is so useful and humble, and precious and pure. Praise to thee, my Lord, for our sister, Mother Earth, who sustains and directs us and brings forth varied fruits and colored flowers and plants. Praise to thee, my Lord, for our sister, bodily death, from whom no man living may escape. Woe to those who die in mortal sin.
Francis added that last verse when he knew he was dying. On his deathbed, to stop anyone making off with him as a premature relic, they had to give him an armed guard. Inevitably, his few belongings did become sacred relics. The cord he wore as a belt, his penitence chain, his staff, and also, appropriately, some of his blood. It's appropriate because today the relics are kept by Franciscan friars at the remote country spot where he received the stigmata. For Francis was the first man in history to bleed, without reason, in the hands, the feet, and the side, places where Christ had suffered his own wounds on the cross. Compared with those riches of the church that Francis had so firmly rejected, this is a fairly modest convent. And yet it's very different from what Francis himself had intended. His last instructions before he died were clear.
Let all the brethren beware of accepting churches, houses, or anything else provided for them, unless they conform to holy poverty, to which we are vowed in our rule. We should always lodge as strangers and as pilgrims.
It was a vain hope. At Assisi, as soon as he was dead, his friars began to collect funds for this massive basilica in his memory. Its frescoes make it one of the great buildings of the Middle Ages, visited by art lovers from all over the world. Yet it's precisely what Francis had forbidden, and it split his followers into two camps. It was the old dilemma. The way of St. Francis was the way of the gospel. This opulence has more often been the way of the church.
C'è una mentalità dell'arte senese. Infatti noi adesso andremo a vedere la cappella di Simone Martini, che è per precorimento, diciamo, dietro Firenze.
Below the superb basilica, 5 miles away in the valley, the simplicity and poverty of St. Francis have been betrayed in more brutal terms in the Church of St. Mary of the Angels. Inside this pompous shell, sitting like a mouse in a palace, is the tiny chapel that was St. Francis's own favorite. He had rebuilt it with his own hands. From this side, it still looks a simple chapel. But any idea that the church really sympathized with Francis is dispelled by the lavish facelift that they gave to the front. And within a century of his death, 4 Franciscans had been burnt for carrying poverty to unseemly lengths. Even so, hic locus sanctus, this is a holy place. No art lovers here. Pilgrimage remains a serious business. Modern pilgrims no longer want to be confronted by skeletons or skulls. St. Francis, with his living dove, is more attractive. St. Francis had thanked God for Sister Death. But halfway through the 14th century, she had a new horror up her sleeve, the Black Death. In 1346, Europeans began to hear rumors of a plague in China. It was already moving west. In 1347, it was in the Middle East. By the spring of 1348, it had reached Italy. As refugees fled before it, they carried the germs with them, until the arrival of the plague came to seem as inevitable as God's judgment itself. The crowded cities of central Italy suffered most, among them Siena. The plague hit Siena harder than almost any other city in Europe. It was said that 50,000 died here in 6 weeks. Today, Siena remains medieval in its appearance, much as the Black Death left it. Even its atmosphere can be ominous. In that dreadful summer, the sun rising over the city square revealed every day new horrors. More corpses pitched into the streets, till 6 out of every 10 people were dead. Nowadays, we'd call it a disaster. In the Middle Ages, they knew it was the judgment of God. With 60% of the people dead, it can have been small consolation that Siena was famous for its doctors. Opposite the cathedral, there's a hospital which was in use at the time of the Black Death. It's still in use today. 15th century frescoes remind modern patients of a very different time. Nurses today offer material comfort. In the Middle Ages, there wasn't much of that. No anesthetics, no antibiotics, no painkillers. When illness could be mistaken for God's anger, spiritual comfort was more easily provided. Just before the Black Death, the people of Siena had decided to build themselves a massive new cathedral, something so huge that it would put to shame forever their old rivals, Florence. They were going to use their existing cathedral, which is the one behind me, as nothing more than the crossing part, the transept. And where I'm sitting would have been somewhere near the top of a splendid new west facade. But then the Black Death came. Half the masons died. And so they wondered, had God meant them to build anything quite so ambitious? Some of the arches they pulled down, others they bricked up, and yet others they left standing quite empty against the sky, as indeed they remain today, gaunt reminders of Siena's moment of pride. Instead of the great cathedral, the people of Siena built, at the foot of their city tower, a tiny chapel, thanking God that at last the Black Death had ended. The people of Siena by now knew of another good way of keeping in credit with God. They could earn indulgences, pardons for their sins, passports to heaven. On the ornate west front of the cathedral, an inscription commemorates the first Holy Year, 1300, when indulgences could be had in Rome. Annus Centenus Romae. At Rome, each 100th year occurs the Jubilee. Sins are washed clear, the penitent set free. Pope Boniface made this decree. 6 3/4 centuries later, Pope Paul announced that 1975 would be another Holy Year. And to the pilgrims who came to Rome, he made that same long-standing promise. They could earn a plenary indulgence and escape however many years of punishment in purgatory their sins might otherwise have earned them. The money to build St. Peter's came partly from the fears and superstitions that are at the heart of the Middle Ages, because much of it was provided by the sale of indulgences to people haunted by hell. They paid handsomely. Their pennies became part of one of the most sumptuous churches in the world, a church which was, incidentally, built to commemorate a poor fisherman, St. Peter. The center of Holy Year, in 1975, as in 1300, is the Pope. And one particular day is surely the central event of the entire year. Easter morning in St. Peter's Square, celebrating the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. It looks a modern enough occasion, a sunny Sunday morning with the usual mishaps of any large crowd. Yet these are pilgrims who have once again been offered that medieval promise, a remission of all their sins, escape from the pains of purgatory in return for this pilgrimage. It may be that few people in this piazza are thinking such old-fashioned thoughts. But there are other details of a present-day pilgrimage to Rome which do hardly seem part of the 20th century. There is no piece of devotion more humble in Rome than to climb on one's knees the Scala Santa, the Holy Staircase. Tradition says that these are the very steps of the house of Pontius Pilate, the steps that Jesus, bleeding, walked down to begin his passion. They were brought 3 centuries later to Rome for safekeeping, and since then millions have climbed them on their knees, including on one occasion a young monk, Martin Luther. Well, Luther decided that rituals such as these were nothing but medieval superstition, but it's clear that even today, for many people to climb each one of these 28 steps, meditating at each one on the sufferings of Jesus, can remain an act of deeply felt faith. And so the contrasts of the Middle Ages remain. The bell that tolls for Easter morning also tolls for death.